out group, not the mutual love of an in group. The only way that you can continue to bind that together is to scapegoat and shave off the people on the outside that are insufficiently pure, continue to point the finger at them and say, well, at least we're not ... that thing over there. But yeah, I mean, it's the reason I've had a bunch of conversations with people on the left, Anna Kasparian, Cenk Uygur, Dave Smith, like people who varied political standings. Anna, the fact that you can only move from left to right, you can't go from right to left. So it's a one-way valve, it's a one-way street. And guess what happens? The street that allows you to move in one direction is going to be more welcoming and better populated.
Yeah, and you I don't know if you may know this either because of age or nationality. You might not know this, but this happened before, actually in my lifetime. So, sort of the late 60s, the 1970s were in many ways, a lot like what we just went through in the last decade. And sort of, Trump the version of Trump at that time was Nixon. The version of things like, the Iraq War was the Vietnam War and so forth. And so there were, energy crises, inflation, all these, hostage crisis, all these crazy comparisons. And basically, what happened actually was, Jimmy Carter lost in 1980, and then Democrats didn't win another national election until 1992. It took actually 12 years for the Democratic Party to get back on track. And really what had to happen was the party and the movement behind it had to go back to the center. And to your point, had to become a party of actual inclusivity, of actual tolerance. It's sort of the Democratic Party had to reconstruct its own big tent. Precisely for the reason you said, which is you have to be able to attract people back. Like you have to get people to be able to come back and feel like they're part of a broad-based coalition and not just part of a very narrow thing. Now, at that time, it took 12 years, right? So, they lost in 80, they lost in 84, they lost in 88, and then Bill Clinton, and then a guy named Al Fromm, who ran this thing called the Democratic Leadership Council, and then Al Gore, kind of put together this program to kind of bring the Democrats back to center, and then that led to, a boom, for the Democratic Party with a much more, sensible centrist, set of policies and a much more, say open-minded and optimistic attitude. By the way, pro-business, pro-patriotism. Kind of treating everybody well. And so I am cautiously optimistic that the current Democratic Party will be able to find its way back in less than 12 years. And I think that would be good for the country, right? I mean, I think even if you're a Republican, you should want there to be a healthy. You should want there to be a healthy, vibrant, viable, centrist, sensible, responsible, stable, configuration of an opposition party, as opposed to what we've seen recently. And so I'm cautiously, there's a Democratic Party, there's a civil war already, kind of playing out the Democratic Party, and there's all these different arguments going back and forth already, and but you're starting to see voices like Rishi Torres and Ro Khanna and others who are standing up saying, it's kind of time to go back to the center. And I'm cautiously optimistic that will happen.
How big of a civil war do you think is unfolding at the moment?
So it's really big. So it's really quite something. So a couple things. So one is there was just a Politico story that was really good that talked about the first big kind of summit meeting that the Democrats have had, which was the DNC hosted a meeting of the state Democratic Party leaders, and it started with a full land acknowledgement, right? And then right, which is step one, okay. And then the current chairman of the party, gave the stem winding speech about how the party absolutely, needs to double down on identity politics, right? So step two, and then this horrific, tragedy in New York with this CEO getting, shot and killed. There's now, loud, prominent voices on the left, including in the press, saying, basically, yay, murder. Which I think is, step three is maybe not like these are not vectoring in the direction of, like, let's just say a successful majority electoral path. But again, like the contrast is clear. Like that is a conceivable path. There are some people who want to go on that path. I think there are a much larger number of, completely sensible people in the party and interested in the party and interested in rejoining the party. Who would like to see the exact opposite. So, but yeah, I mean, they are going to, argue this and litigate this, I think, all the way out. I think they really feel like they have to argue this. And you mentioned the folks you've talked to, like, there are now some, I think some voices, including some, folks that are pretty far left, who are kind of saying, all right, let's pause for a moment and make sure we're not going off the cliff.
You work with a lot of founders, CEOs, tons of your friends will be in that position too. What do you make of the response to the Brian Thompson killing and the situation more broadly?
Well, the killing itself was obviously an enormous shock, and I know people who knew him and had been with him recently. So he was a well known figure in the healthcare industry. So very very respected among in the sort of the business circles. Yeah, I mean, it's an enormous shock, and then of course, at first you're just like, well, these things are either random or or most murders are committed by somebody in somebody's personal life. The way this one seems to be unfolding, is, and I don't know anything that's not in the press, but it seems to have a ideological motivation behind it, and so, and then it's like, okay, is that just a one-off, or, is this the beginning of a pattern? I would say a lot of people I talk to are very disconcerted by, I would say, the enthusiasm that a lot of people in the press are showing to. Yeah, there have been a shockingly large number of stories of the line of course, murder is bad, but
we shouldn't laugh. I shouldn't laugh.
Right. Well, I mean, it is. I mean, you have to laugh or you cry, right? So, and then it's like 3,000 words that come after the but, right? And it's like, well, okay, like, which is basically a long-winded, sort of justification for murder. And so, that is disconcerting. There are some comedians now, that have gotten in the game. And so, I would say this is fairly disconcerting. I mean, we'll see what happens. The scary scenario, I mentioned the 70s, domestic terror actually got to be quite a thing in the 70s in the US. And there's this great book called Days of Rage that kind of chronicles basically this like very widespread pattern of domestic terror, ideologically motivated domestic terror in the 70s. By many kind of sort of radical revolutionary groups, the Weather Underground and many others, what a lot of those domestic terrorists had in common was sort of this very very kind of privileged backgrounds. A lot of these were like Ivy League, like the Weather Underground came out of Columbia University, and then domestic terrorists coming out of places like UC Berkeley, and then sort of often very privileged backgrounds, very kind of upper kind of elite upper middle class people. And then, ended up in some cases going on the lam for years, being hunted by the FBI. And there were years in the 1970s when there were thousands of terror bombings a year. And then there was a run of, anti-corporate, basically murder and terrorism in Germany, kind of through that period into the 80s, with this thing called the Bader-Meinhof group and so forth. And so, there's always been this kind of violent edge to kind of call it the anti-corporate, anti-business, anti-industrial, kind of. By the way, a little bit of that, some of that's on the left, some of that's on the right. There's different, you can squint different ways. Ted Kaczynski was on the right. This guy maybe appears to be a little bit more on the left. And so, this pattern has unfolded before. I don't know that it's ever been effective at causing any of the change that its proponents seem to want. It seems to, these tactics, violent tactics, usually backfire in our societies. But certainly hope that this doesn't become a copycat situation. And I do think it's striking. I mean, I think there are a lot of voices in American public life who are behaving quite irresponsibly right now.
What did they think that they're doing? That sometimes people that run healthcare organizations don't pay out when people should be paid out. Therefore, it's okay to kill the person at the top.
Yeah, it's the thing. Well, it's of course murder is bad, but, and then in the 3,000 words is basically what you said. So the whole healthcare situation is it's obviously very complicated and very emotional. And this can become a very long conversation, but the sort of key fact that all Western countries are trying to kind of grapple with, and this is true of the US, but also Canada and the UK and the rest of Europe. Basically there's two key facts. So key fact number one is healthcare is at like a fifth of US GDP in terms of spending. So like a fifth of all national production per year goes to healthcare. And that number is rising. The healthcare is basically rising. And if you just chart this on a graph, it's just very clear what's happening is healthcare left unchecked is going to go from being a fifth of the economy to a fourth to a third to a half. And then, someday in the future, effectively all of it. And then nobody wants to pay for it. Right. Right. And so like nobody wants to pay, everybody wants somebody else to pay for it. And then just saying the government should pay for it, of course, doesn't answer the question because the government has to be funded by somebody. And so that means taxpayers have to pay for it. And so you get in all these questions. And of course, we live in a progressive taxation system in which, people who make more money pay a higher percentage of taxes. And, there's big political fights over that. And I'm kind of neutral on that. I don't really care. It's not one of my issues. But it's part of this big fight over who pays for it. So that's issue number one, and that's just going to it's going to bring out a lot of emotion to people because, of course, especially as you get closer to end of life or you get into these very bad chronic conditions that require a lot of money to take care of people, it's this real challenge of how to pay for it. And then the other kind of key kind of fact is all these countries also are aging very rapidly. right? The demographics are headed in the direction of increased average age, and the consequence of that is a sharp reduction in the percentage of working age people versus older people, retirees. And the whole basis for every social welfare system in the world is that the current workers pay for the current retirees, right? That is the basis. There is no, the Social Security Trust Fund doesn't exist. The money that you pay in, you don't get later. Your money you pay in today gets paid out to old people today. And then when you're old, there need to be young workers in the system to be able to generate the money to pay you. And that's true for Social Security. It's true for Medicare. It's true for Medicaid. It's true for all of these it's true of any socialized health system. It'd be true of government-funded health system. It'd be the same thing. It's just, for taxpayers. Taxpayers are people who work. And so if the demographics go upside down and you have a country, and you can see the future in places like Japan, where you just have like way more old people than you have young people. And then you just have this like fundamental mismatch, and then you literally quite simply can't pay for it. And so like these two things kind of put this whole issue in a vice. Now, what we try to do, like in our line of work, which is, tech and biotech and VC, what we try to do is figure out ways to kind of get out of that vice, primarily through new technologies that at least, in some cases will provide new kinds of healthcare, new kinds of drugs, and new kinds of medical devices, but also things that are able to break that price curve and able to make healthcare much cheaper, right? That's the other way to solve it, is you make all this stuff much cheaper. And that's where, we get excited about things like, for example, AI in healthcare, right? And, maybe the prospect that instead of, people having, only having human doctors, maybe a lot of, routine medical interactions are with AI doctors. And then, you only consult with a human doctor when something gets, really sensitive. And, I think there's a reasonable chance in the next few years that we can figure out how to do that. So hopefully we can solve this with technology. It is weird, I will say, and it's coming out in this kind of current, kind of debate and controversy. It is weird that the same people who are the maddest about healthcare costs rising and not being able to pay for it are also the ones who hate technology the most. Right? Like,
yeah,
people who care most about climate, the people who care most about climate and carbon emissions hate nuclear energy the most, right? And it's like, all right, we are genuinely trying to help solve these. Those of us in tech are genuinely trying to help solve these problems.
What do you think that is? Is it just some sort of generalized skepticism, generalized scrutiny over rich people, that they don't have the best interests at heart of the common folk?
Yeah, well, there's this part of it's just like simply moral intuitions, right? And so you have these kind of moral intuitions and moral intuitions presumably evolved to be the way they are according to kind of historical conditions of how people lived. But historically, people lived in these very small, kind of communities. One way of describing, there's this great book called The Ancient City that goes back and reconstructs basically prehistoric civilization, like what it was like. And basically the conclusion of it is, sort of go back 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years and further back. Basically we all lived in these very small tribes, maxed out at a few hundred people. And then you could kind of describe the politics of the tribe being sort of a hybrid of like absolute fascism combined with absolute communism, right? Like at the same time, right? So it was like absolute fascism in that the father of the family or the leader of the tribe had the total power of life or death over all the members of the tribe and could kill them at any moment, for whatever reason he wanted to. And then it was also pure communism in that there was no market economy. Everybody shared everything. And if you went out and killed an animal and brought it back and didn't share the food, they would kill it. You had to share the food. Like everything had to be shared because it was how you were. Both of those forms of governance were basically how the tribe would survive. It needed total discipline and total sharing, right, at the same time. And so we evolve these moral intuitions that basically says, maybe we don't want the fascism part, but we kind of want everything to be shared. We want everything to be equal. Having inequality is sort of intrinsically morally offensive to us. And so we naturally drive towards, and who can possibly argue against, wouldn't it be desirable if everybody had the same, how it's default unfair for some people to have more than others. And then, of course, profit, particularly drives people crazy, right? Because profit in the capitalist system, if you have this moral intuition, it feels like it's unfair because it feels like it's money that's been extracted that's not doing anything. There was, I won't name names, but there was a congressman this morning who tweeted 2 back-to-back tweets. And he said, it's just completely absurd and outrageous that the American health insurance industry generates $1.4 trillion in profits per year. And he said, that's just like so clearly unfair because that's, presumptively that's $1.4 trillion being extracted, providing, no value at all. And then like 4 hours later, there was a second tweet, which he said, actually, I learned that actually it's $1.4 trillion in revenue, not profit. And total profits are, a very small fraction of what I thought it was. right?
But still,
but still, right, equally absurd and unfair, right?
Going back to sort of where we're at the moment, I know that you've been heavily involved in a lot of meetings over the last month or so. How much, having been on every side of the fence and above it and inside of it, how much governmental efficiency is there to improve on, in your opinion?
Oh, like absolutely enormous, and it's actually interesting in that this actually historically this is actually a bipartisan question, and I actually think that the Vivek and Elon are looking at it in a very bipartisan way, and you may have already seen there are already some Democrats signing up for the Doge Congressional Caucus, and coming out. Even Bernie Sanders, to his credit, came out and said he certainly agrees with Elon and Vivek, specifically on the topic of military spending, which is of course one of the big areas. And so that's that's significant. So it historically is a bipartisan topic. When I was younger, I mentioned the sort of Clinton Gore comeback in '92. This was actually a big theme of the Clinton Gore campaign in '92, and actually Al Gore, who I know, I've known over the years. Al Gore actually had a whole program like the Doge, actually at the time called REGO, REGO, called Reinventing Government. And he said many of the same things that actually Elon and Vivek are saying today. And he had this famous, he made it famous at the time. You find it on YouTube. There's this famous thing he did to kind of visualize this, which is he went on the David Letterman show at the time, and he took out, it was like the Department of Defense was like buying like $600 shatterproof ashtrays. And he took them onto the Letterman show with a chisel, and safety glasses, and gave it a big whack, and of course it fractures just like any other ashtray. So like anyway, so there was a whole program around that. They made a little bit of progress. So anyway, I think everybody effectively agrees that there's who doesn't want tax money to be spent efficiently, who doesn't want to get results, who doesn't want to eliminate waste and fraud. Like these are kind of these are those are hard things to argue against. In terms of methods, the big change here is that we've never, in the past, these have been government officials trying to figure this out, or commissions or whatever.
Some may say the blind leading the blind.
Some may say participants in the system attempting to reform the system from within, let's say. And this, of course, what's starkly different here is to have people of the caliber of Elon and Vivek, who are tremendously accomplished entrepreneurs and founders, and people who run businesses, and people who understand how to do things that, like, and Elon. Vivek's obviously very smart on all this, but Elon is legendary for being able to think, as he says, think from first principles on things like costs. And if you read the books about him, he's always focused on that. And so he's going to bring a toolkit that has been, very successfully deployed at some of the world's leading, literally some of the world's leading companies like Tesla and SpaceX. And he's going to bring that to the government for the first time.
How is Elon so productive? Have you ever deconstructed this?
So actually, I've known Elon for a long time. I didn't work with him for a very long time. Just we were working on different things. But I've been working with him quite closely for the last couple of years, starting with the X acquisition, and then we've also invested in XAI and in the SpaceX. And so we now work on 3 companies together to different degrees, and now the government stuff. Yeah, I mean, there's basically he has an operating method that he's developed that I would say is very unusual by modern standards. I'm not aware of another current CEO who operates the way that he does, and I think probably the single biggest kind of question in all of business right now is why don't more CEOs operate the way that he does? And it's a complicated question we could talk about. But if you go back in history, you find characters more like him. And so especially like the industrialists of the late 1800s, early 1900s, people like Henry Ford or Andrew Carnegie or Thomas Watson, who built IBM. If you go back and read the biographies of people like that, Andrew Mellon, those guys, Cornelius Vanderbilt, like those guys ran very similar to the way that Elon runs things. And it's just this like the top line thing is just this incredible devotion from the leader of the company to fully, deeply understand what the company does, and to be, completely knowledgeable about every aspect of it, and to be in the trenches and talking directly to the people who do the work, deeply understanding the issues, and being the lead problem solver in the organization. And basically, what Elon does is he shows up every week at each of his companies. He identifies the biggest problem that the company's having that week, and he fixes it. Right. And then he does that every week for 52 weeks in a row. And then each of his companies has solved the 52 biggest problems that year, like in that year. And most other large companies are still having the planning meeting, for the pre-planning meeting, for the board meeting, for the presentation, for the this, for the with the compliance review and the legal review, and he's just like it's this level of both like incredible intellectual capability coupled with incredible force of personality, moral authority, execution capability, focus on fundamentals. That is just like really amazing to watch. And then, by the way, the side effect of it is he attracts many of the best people in the world to work with him. Because if you work with Elon, like the expectations are through the roof in terms of your level of performance, and he is going to know who you are, and he is going to know what you've done, and he's going to know what you've done this week, and he's going to know if you're underperforming, and he may fire you in the meeting if you're not carrying your weight. But if you are as committed to the company as he is and working hard and capable, many people who have worked for him say that they had the best experience of their lives when they were working for him. And so then there's this attraction thing, and that's why I think his companies compound the way they do, is because of this, they just keep bringing.
They're a black hole that sucks in the best talent. If you're the best in the world, you want to work hard